liana species such as Japanese honeysuckle and kudzu, more research on resprouting and fire effects in lianas is needed. And one such species is the invasive Oriental bittersweet, Celastrus orbiculatus. And Stacey, I'll let you start now. Are you there?
I'm here. So I'll be talking a little bit about what are lianas. It's kind of a new term for some of you. So lianas are woody vines, pretty simple. It's traditionally a tropical terminology that's starting to be adapted into areas like we live in temperate zones. So it's a good way to kind of distinguish between a woody vine versus something like a more herbaceous vine, like a morning glory, that type of thing. And they're often overlooked because no one really, in all honesty, wants to deal with these plants. They're difficult to study because they have multiple sprouts. They don't support themselves. They get tangled up, so it's difficult to kind of address them. And just some famous or infamous lianas that you might be familiar with, we have things like poison ivy, grapes, American bittersweet, then here's Oriental bittersweet, Virginia creeper, greenbrier. This is Lianas dioica, and then we have Japanese honeysuckle. So just to give you a little background about Oriental bittersweet, it was introduced as a horticultural plant from Eastern Asia in the 1860s. And on the bottom left here in the slide, you can see this distribution map of China, and the darker, larger circles in the northern part of China, Japan, and Korea there are basically the native range of this species in Eastern Asia. It was planted widely on the East Coast. It was first introduced into areas like Boston and New York, and it was planted for, as I said, horticultural purposes. Unfortunately, it wasn't really noticed as highly invasive until the mid-1900s, and that's, two reasons for that. One is that, as other invasive species, it has a lag phase, so until there's enough of it out on the landscape, you're not going to really be seeing it. But the other problem is that it's very, very similar in appearance to the native American bittersweet, and when I had done research at the University of Connecticut, we often found in the herbarium folders American Oriental bittersweet misfiled in American bittersweet folders. So that was definitely a problem for this plant. This is a distribution in North America. On the left, we have the Oriental bittersweet distribution. On the right, the native American distribution. The dark colors indicate states that these species have been recorded in, and I guess the lighter colors are indicating county records, but I suspect that that might be a little bit or underrepresented for some of these species here. So you can see that Oriental bittersweet has made it across the Mississippi and further west and pretty far north as well. The American bittersweet actually has a very large geographic range in the United States and crosses a lot of different climate areas and gets as far west as Montana and western Texas. Again, one of the issues with Oriental bittersweet is the kind of cultural connection that people feel with this plant. This is a copy of Yankee magazine, which is a magazine from where I had returned to New England. This was on the cover back in the early 2000s, much to my chagrin. And it has all these great craft projects that you can do with Oriental bittersweet. And the one thing it has here is that nothing says autumn in New England is like a bouquet of bittersweet. So there's, again, this cultural connection that people feel attached to the plant, even though it's not the best plant for them to be growing. So you can see these wreaths and things that people make out of Oriental bittersweet. Birds can take those fruits right off your door. If you throw it in the compost pile, you're going to get more bittersweet seedlings. And then there's this little 1-inch by 1-inch disclaimer in the upper right, which I'll blow up for all of you. And it basically has this disclaimer that it's an invasive vine and, not to, plant it too much and to prune it rigorously to keep it under control, which maybe, as we go through this talk, maybe is not the best advice. So impacts of Oriental bittersweet on plant communities, it can basically form topiaries of the host plants beneath it. And this is more worrisome, is not just on roadsides, but we get it into places like this oak savanna here. So all that bright yellow stuff all over the ground, all up in the trees. This is the fall color for Oriental bittersweet. So it's actually right now is like prime time for seeing Oriental bittersweet on trees. And you can see as it infiltrates these forested settings. It can girdle trees. So on the left you can see this vine really cutting into this small tree here. And then it produces prolific fruit, which birds can disperse very long distances from the canopies. This is a image of an Oriental bittersweet stem that's fairly large. You can see it's about 4 inches across. I've seen them up to 6 or 7 inches across in some cases. And then for the land managers out here, just to kind of give a brief overview of how to distinguish Oriental and American bittersweet for management purposes, this is a chart, and I'll have pictures after I go through it. of how to tell the two species apart in brief. The inflorescence, so the flower and fruits of Oriental Bittersweet are located all along the branches in the leaf axils, whereas American Bittersweet, they're only located at the ends of the branches, so they sort of look like bunches of grapes hanging off the ends of the branches. Pollen color is kind of a brief time that we can use that type of character, and it's only for the male plants because Bittersweet, both Oriental and American Bittersweet, have male and female plants. For the male plants, the pollen of Oriental Bittersweet is white, and for American Bittersweet, it's yellow. When they fruit at this time of year is probably the best time to see the color difference. Oriental Bittersweet has yellow to sometimes yellowy green capsules around the fruit, whereas the American Bittersweet has orange. And then a vegetative characteristic that Noel and I had kind of discovered working in the springs at Indiana Dunes is how in the spring when they very first leaf out, you can tell some differences in the way the leaves are arranged. And I'll show a picture of that for sure. The Oriental Bittersweet, they're more book-like, so the leaves are kind of facing each other flatly in the bud. Whereas American Bittersweet, the edges of the leaves are rolled up like a scroll. So here's an image of the inflorescences of Oriental and American Bittersweet. On the left, Oriental Bittersweet, again, you can see the fruits all along the branches and that yellow capsule color. American Bittersweet on the right, you can see again that the fruits are just at the ends of branches in bunches of grapes, and they're much more orange in color. Here's a close-up of the fruit capsule colors, the yellow versus the orange. And then here's the spring leaf presentations I was talking about. On the left, you can see how Oriental Bittersweet, when it's just leafing out in the spring, the leaves are flat and facing each other in the bud, and then American Bittersweet, on the edges of those leaves on the leaf margins, you can see how they're rolled in like a scroll. So one way that managers could use that vegetative character, because that works for male and female plants, you don't need fruit, is you could go out in that time of year when it's just starting to break bud and mark the plants for control later in the season.
Back to me. So it's been known for a long time that Oriental Bittersweet resprouts and root suckers. This quote from Dyer in 1994. But no one had ever actually studied this. And so when the opportunity arose to study exotics in the eastern U.S. from the Joint Fire Science Program, we put in a proposal titled "To Burn or Not to Burn Oriental Bittersweet," a fire manager's conundrum, to investigate this trait of the species, but also other fire effects as well. So we looked at fire effects on seeds, and then individuals, and then populations, and then across the landscape, so at a scaled approach of study. And we looked at fire effects on seed viability. We looked at post-fire effects on the establishment of plants. And then we looked at fire effects on established populations. And lastly, we looked at fire effects on bittersweet at the landscape scale. So I'm going to start off talking about fire effects on seed viability. We took three approaches in regards to heat and fire. We looked at the effects of wet heat on seed viability. That's exposing seeds and fruits to boiling water, different volumes. I'll talk about that in a minute. We studied the effects of dry heat, basically putting seeds and fruits in an oven at set temperatures for certain amounts of time. And then we looked at effects of prescribed burns on seeds in packets. So looking at wet heat is kind of a tricky thing because it's hard to deliver wet heat and how to control it. And the way we took was to control the maximum temperature by giving different volumes of boiling water. So in our Erlenmeyer flasks, when you pour water into them, boiling water into them, it cools as it goes through the air. So it's actually not exposed to the boiling temperature of water. It's below that. And so the greater the volume, the closer to boiling you get. And you can see at the top there are thermocouples sticking out of the flask. So we recorded the duration of the temperature course, and also we stopped after they reached room temperature. We then tested the seeds for viability with the Tetrazolium salt. It stains living tissue pink on the right, and then the dead tissue isn't stained pink, and then we have maybe what we could call the living dead partially dead in the middle. There were a few instances of those difficult cases. So looking at maximum temperature that the seeds and fruits experienced, fruits being the blue circles and seeds being the purple diamonds, we see a strong relationship between percent viable on the x-axis, y-axis, and temperature with viability. So viability decreases as temperature increases, up to around about 90 degrees centigrade. You had 100% kill. There's less strong relationship with fruits, and that's because fruits protect the seeds, and there were other variables that weren't controlled. This next graph here shows duration of exposure, and in terms of hours, minutes, and seconds. So here's 57.36 seconds. Is my arrow working? Do people see my arrow? Well, okay. Anyways,
no, I think you have to I think Noel, you have to actually grab the arrow and begin to move it. Yep.
There it is. Okay, I got it.
Take it again.
Yeah. So again, here we see a stronger relationship for the fruits in terms of duration of exposure. And again, those that were exposed to temperature duration of around an hour had complete loss of viability. Thank you for that. Still learning this thing. Oh, what happened here? Okay. Well, this graph should have a white background, but this is the graph of volume. So we gave fruits and seeds no treatment. That's the control right here. We gave some 20 mLs, 50 mLs, and 100 mLs. And the y-axis is, again, viability. So this is 100% viability. And this is seeds and fruit. And over here is seeds alone. And again, we see decreasing viability with increased volume of exposure to wet heat. Oh boy. So this graph, this is unfortunate, but this graph is for dry heat. And we have, again, seeds and fruit on the left and seeds on the right. And we see the control in red. And then the blue, green, and purple are the different exposure times of 1 minute, 3 minutes, and 5 minutes. And so we expose seeds to 60 degrees C up to 140 degrees C and 20 degrees C intervals. And we see that there was an interaction between duration and temperature. And the longer they were exposed to that temperature, the greater the loss of viability in both cases, but it was quicker in the seeds because they weren't protected by the fruit outside. So, and here we see that at 120 degrees C, the seeds were well, actually, at 140 degrees C, the seeds exposed for 3 minutes were completely killed, whereas at the same temperature and same duration in the fruits, there was more than 50% of the seeds were viable. We exposed seeds in wire packets out in the field during 2 prescribed fires. 1 packet on top of the litter and 1 under the litter, and we attached to them a aluminum tag that had temperature-sensitive paints. And you can see the temperatures that we estimated based on these crude temperature paints. And you can see this upper tag was melted, the aluminum, so that's about, I think, 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. But anyways, none of this, all the seeds and the fruits were completely charred, so there was no viability. So in a good hot fire, you can expect to kill the seeds. So seeds and fruits exposed to hot water above a maximum temperature of, say, 90 degrees C, that's about 194 Fahrenheit, are killed, especially if it takes an hour for the temperature to decline to, and it should be room temperature, which would be 25 degrees C, not 60. So that's an error. my fault. And then seeds and fruits exposed to dry heat temperatures above 140 degrees C are completely killed for 5 minutes in regards to the fruits. This slide is an error again, and 3 minutes for seeds alone. And these temperatures are easily reached in prescribed burns and wildfires. So seeds and fruits on or near the ground will be killed by fire. Whether fruits above the ground are burned enough to kill the seeds will depend on the fire intensity and the type of fire. Since fruits mature in the fall and are only eaten by birds in the early winter, fall burns may not reduce the seed abundance. Some fruits do fall on the ground, so they would be there, but the ones that the birds consume are obviously defecated later as seed in some, perhaps some nutrients. Spring burns may be more effective in killing seeds since they have been dispersed by that time. So it's back to you, Stacey.
Thanks, Noel. Okay, so I'll be talking about the second part of our outline here, which is post-fire effects on establishment of Oriental Bittersweet by seed. So basically, the question we try to address here is after a prescribed fire or wildfire burns up litter, sometimes takes out small saplings and things like that, what are we going to end up with? Are we going to end up with an environment more conducive to germination of Oriental Bittersweet by seed? So basically, are we going to create safe sites or better sites for when birds come in and disperse them, or if they're passively dispersed in the spring, that more seedlings of Oriental Bittersweet are going to germinate? So here's our experimental design that we used for this. We had 72 of these 6 by 6 meter experimental blocks across the landscape, and we basically had them in 6 different habitat types, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we have our 6 by 6 meter plots, and we had 2 by 2 meter treatment plots in each of the corners of the plot. And what we did was we had 4 different treatments. The first was a control where we left the vegetation, litter, everything intact. The second was this green, which is the litter remove plots, where we removed, using weed whackers and such, all of the standing, woody anything, and then raked out all of the litter from those plots to kind of simulate the effect of fire would have on removing those things. But then we also had fire treatments as well, because fire does other things besides just remove litter. It can input nutrients and do different things to the habitat. So we had a low intensity burn, which was basically the ambient litter and fuels that were there. And then we had a high intensity burn also, which is we created by taking all of the litter that we removed from the litter remove plot and adding it to that high intensity burn plot to get higher fuel loads and higher temperatures. After we did the burns, we then in the spring of the year or the following the burns, we had these 25 by 25 centimeter subplots, which we added 25 seeds to. So I'll flip to the next slide so you can kind of see how that looks. So here's our little 25 by 25 centimeter grids. And you can see we had these little grid cells here, and we put 1 seed into each of those little cells. That way we could try to relocate the seedlings monthly, which is we census them basically from May to September of every year. And we just dropped the seeds down. We didn't put them under the litter. We just tried to have them simulating falling off the vines. And we did collect those seeds in the very early spring and late winter. That way they were exposed to and stratified, so we knew that they had their cold treatment. So, and then we would go back monthly and collect a variety of different measurements on the seedlings. So here's our little bittersweet seedling here in the grid cell. So I told you we had 6 different habitat types. At Indiana Dunes, there's 2 main soil types present. There's moraine soils and sandy soils. So we had 3 different habitats on each of those 2 soil types. So for the moraine soils, we had moraine prairie, and this is actually a nice picture because you can see those red flags as a high intensity burn, and then the yellow or the low intensity burn. You can see the flames of that one forwards in the picture are moving faster and are hotter than those ones behind it. So this is the moraine prairie. Then we had oak hickory forest, which was basically forest dominated by oak and hickory. And then we had beech maple forest also on these moraine type of habitats. With that obviously the litter in a beech maple forest is a lot different than in an oak hickory forest. And then for our sandy soil habitats, we had sand prairie, which are basically dominated by sort of C4 grasses And then we had oak savannas dominated by black oak. And then finally we had oak forest, and these were kind of, had oaks as a dominant tree, but much more closed in savanna habitat, and sometimes had pine and things like that mixed in. And this is a really nice picture because actually is from above during one of our research burns. And you can see the red flags in the upper right corner, the high intensity, the upper left are the low intensity fire, and then behind the firefighter there with the white flags is the control. You can see all the litter down, and then in the green flags you can see all the litter is removed from that plot. So what types of data did we collect? We counted the number of seedlings that were germinated every month, and we'll refer to those as the germinants in the plots. We also measured the heights of the seedlings as we counted them from the ground to the tips of them. And then after 2 full growing seasons had elapsed, we collected the biomass of the plants. So we harvested them and dried them and weighed them. And we also took some environmental measurements to add to our analysis. We measured canopy cover by using these hemispherical photographs. You can see an image of one here in the bottom of the picture. And then we also collected soil samples and sent them away to have soil nutrients evaluated on them. And we used ANOVA to analyze the data, as well as regression, but I'll be kind of focusing on the ANOVA results here, and I'll kind of interject some of the regression analyses as we're talking about them. All right, so this is the overview graph of germination through time. And on the y-axis, you can see we have May to September of year 1, and then May to September of the second growing season. And on the bottom left is the legend for which of the 6 habitats we're talking about. And on the y-axis, we have percent germinants, so the percentage of the mean percentage of germinants for each month across all the fire treatments. So this is kind of just an overall view of what we saw in terms of germination. And so if you look at the open circles here, we have the moraine prairie plots. And you can see that in May, like after we had added the seeds in April, we didn't see too much going on. But then by June, we have this kind of increase of seedlings that we were seeing in the plots. And the moraine prairie, you can see this pretty high peak here in the first year of germinants. And then we have this kind of crash here, and this is the overwinter mortality that occurs with these seedlings, and then kind of leveling off. And this is not the percent of new germinants. This is just the percent of seedlings out of 25 that we had in each of those plots, so the total. Then if we look at something like the beech maple plot, you can see, again, we had this initial flush of seedlings in June, and they kind of plummeted throughout that summer. And that particular summer of 2010 was very hot and humid, so we suspect that bittersweet seedlings did not do too well in those hot and humid conditions. What's interesting, though, is in the oak hickory forest that we don't see that sharp of a drop, and it's probably because these oak hickory forests were a little bit drier than the beech maple forests were. So our first graph is mean peak germination, and you can see here that I'm not showing on the x-axis any fire treatments, and that's because the fire treatment had no effect on the peak number of germinants we saw in those plots. So on the x-axis, we have the 6 habitat types. We have the 2 graphs for year 1 and then year 2 of the growing seasons. And on the y-axis, we have the peak number of germinants, which basically is the highest percentage of germinants we saw throughout the growing season in each of those habitats. And these are the mean values with standard errors. And the different letters on the error bars indicate statistically significant differences. So in the first year, moraine prairie, oak hickory, and beech maple forest had the highest peak number of germinants, while the sand prairie and oak savannas had the lowest peak number of germinants. By the second year, we had some mortality, and the moraine prairie alone had the highest peak number of germinants throughout the entire growing season, followed by the oak hickory forest here. The regression line indicated that in the first year of growth, that potassium had a positive effect on the peak percentage of germinants, and that would be most likely because that moraine prairie and oak hickory sites that we had the highest percentage of potassium. By the second year, canopy openness, so how open the canopy was, actually influenced the seedlings to some extent, and was a positive influence on what the peak percentage of germinants was. Now here we're looking at mean survival. So again, you'll see that I have no fire effects on the x-axis because the fire treatment and the litter removal treatment, I shouldn't just say fire treatment, the treatments, didn't have any effect on mean survival. And the survival is the proportion of survival. So this is looking at plots that had germinants, not the ones that didn't have any, but just the ones that had germinants, and then what percentage of those survived from June to September, basically. So we have that proportion here on the y-axis. You can see that there's not that much difference between them. Marine prairie, sand prairie, beech maple, oak hickory are all the same. But just take a note here that, remember, sand prairie and oak savanna had the lowest peak percentage of germinants, but the survival is actually pretty good. So even though it's hard for these seedlings to germinate in oak savanna and sand prairie, they're surviving once they do germinate. Whereas the marine prairie, they're surviving too, but maybe, and then by the second year, the survival is basically the same throughout all the different habitat types. Now looking at seedling heights, we wanted to kind of get an idea of how growth was affected by the different treatments. And in this case, you can see that the two left panels are looking at the habitats, and the two right panels are looking at fire treatment. So we actually got a fire treatment effect with height. These top two here are looking at the June height of year 1. So that's indicating how tall these seedlings were at initial germination. And you can see that in the habitat types, the moraine prairie, the oak forest, and the sand prairie have the tallest seedlings at initial germination. But which we found more interesting is if you look at the fire treatments here, that the control treatment had the tallest seedlings. And that's most likely because that litter was intact in those plots. So those little seedlings needed to stretch themselves out quite a lot to get above the litter layer. Now, September height is basically the height at harvest, the final height. And here, the oak forest actually had the tallest seedlings, so that was kind of an interesting result. You can also see that the control had very tall seedlings throughout the study, and then we had this high-intensity burn with tall seedlings. And I just want to kind of caution with that. The savanna plots were the ones, there was a few there that had high-intensity burn treatment with tall seedlings for whatever reason, but none of the other habitats really showed that. So we have to do a little bit more investigation into why that might have been. Now, looking at final biomass of the seedlings, again, across the 6 habitats, the fire treatment was not significant in this case. The oak forest had the tallest seedlings from the previous slide, but they also had the heaviest seedlings. It could be that the oak forest might be just kind of a perfect blend for these Oriental bittersweet seedlings. It's a little bit shaded, so it's not too dry, hot, and exposed. And they also have enough litter that kind of stimulates those seedlings to sort of grow taller. So just to summarize this, peak germination and proportion survival of bittersweet seedlings was not affected by the burn treatment. So there's good news and bad news there. The good news is burning isn't making the habitat more susceptible to seeds of Oriental bittersweet coming in and invading. The bad news is if you don't burn, the plant can still come into these habitats that are intact with undisturbed litter. So that's kind of a disturbing result on some level. At initial germination, the mean height of the seedlings in the control treatment was the greatest. And again, that was because of this leaf litter layer. And the final heights of the seedlings were the tallest in the oak forest and the control and high intensity burn treatments. And again, that caveat with that savanna one really being the only with the high intensity burn. And then final biomass was greatest in the oak forest habitat. I'm going to hand it back over to Noel now.
Thank you, Stacey. So now I'm going to talk about the fire effects on established plants. And we thought that burning or cutting might be 2 ways that we could control bittersweet infestations. And so we asked, how does fire affect established plants? And although we have some hints in the literature, are cutting versus burning similar in their effects on resprouting? And so our hypothesis was that fire would increase resprouting based on what we knew, and cutting and burning might not be equivalent. So in the course of doing treatments, which I'll explain in a minute, we wanted to look at also the reserves in the roots of the bittersweet plants to see if our treatments were having an effect on the health of the plants in a sense. Total nonstructural carbohydrates are starches and sugars that are often stored in the roots of the plants, and that's separate from starch that's converted to lignin and cellulose for structure. And these non-structural carbohydrates are often readily available for regrowth if the plant is damaged. Across the Indiana dunes, we had 8 sites, 4 on sand and 4 on the richer moraine soils. At each site, we had 7 to 9 treatment plots, and the number was determined by the extent and scale of the infestation. Some were just not big enough to put 7 treatment plots. So we have here one, oops, gotta grab that arrow. I don't know why it's not coming. Well, we've got, there we go. Okay, we've got this sand site, Furnaceville, Mineral Springs, and Marquette Trail. And then we have a cluster of 4. One is hidden under the other, but there's actually 4 sites here on the glacial moraine. This is the Marquette Trail savanna site, which is just encroached with bittersweet. And this is a flat moraine site with quite a bit of older bittersweet as well. At each site, then, we had 7 to 9 treatment plots, and these are 10 by 10 meters, and treatments were assigned randomly, and I'll discuss the treatments in a minute. Each plot had a 1 meter buffer around the periphery, and then the central portion was divided into 4 quadrants, and each one had a randomly placed 1 meter squared subplot. The purpose of the subplots was to sample, to capture some of the local spatial variability that one finds in these infestations. Okay, so we initially had 2 treatment series that was a spring or a late dormant season treatment series, and then a summer treatment series. But in 2010, the weather conspired to make it difficult to do our growing season series. We had almost twice the average rainfall, and by the end of June, when we wanted to do our treatments, the moraine sites had no fuel to burn, and the savanna sites were so rank with bittersweet and other vegetation that doing a burn, we would have had to pour hundreds of gallons of fuel on that. If any of you have ever done growing season burns, under a canopy of trees, you can only burn really where there's sunlight hitting the litter. So we had to change our plans, and we did a fall series as well. And so both series have a control treatment where we did nothing, a burn treatment, a cut treatment, which we did with a weed whip, and then a cut and burn treatment combined. And then we modified the last series of treatments that were supposed to be herbicides. So instead of doing a herbicide in the spring series, we did a cut in early July. And then in the fall series, we did some herbiciding. And in the slides that follow, these last 2 treatments are clumped together as ancillary treatments. And we did our sampling in the middle of the growing season. So we had individual responses where we took individual stems of different size classes. We tagged 5 of those in each plot and followed them. The size classes were seedlings, stems less than 5 millimeters in diameter, those 5.1 to 10, 10.1 to 15, and greater than 15 millimeters in diameter. And we counted the number of resprouts and root suckers associated with the stem pre and post treatment. And resprouts are new shoots on living shoots. In other words, they weren't killed, but they resprouted. And root suckers are resprouts associated with the roots adjacent to top-killed shoots. We also then sampled 3 roots in each month for total nonstructural carbohydrates. We collected them in the morning so that we didn't cut across the diurnal variation that occurs in the nonstructural carbohydrates. We sampled in March, May, July, and October of 2010, and then April, May, and July 2011. And we processed the samples, and then we used a modified starch and sugar analysis protocol that we got from Dr. Richard Kobe. Our population response was to measure the cover, estimate the cover of bittersweet in each treatment plot, subplot. And then we also counted this number of stems in the same size classes, except that the smallest size class was subdivided into two size classes, 0 to 2.5 millimeters and 2.51 to 5 millimeters. We then analyzed the data calculated as the change, that is the value post-treatment minus the value pre-treatment. And we also measured a bunch of environmental variables, and I'm only going to talk about this here because I'm still in the throes of doing some sophisticated modeling with this to see which of these variables might relate to the changes we were seeing in our plots. We did measure these things. So this is a moraine site being burned. Sometimes it was difficult to burn, and we did strips. We never lit inside our subplots. We let the fire burn in there as it would. Our fires all had a similar maximum or peak temperature, except for those on the sand in the fall. They had a significantly higher temperature. So first we're going to look at the individual responses, and this is survival. There was a significant interaction between size class and soil type and treatment. And so we'll look at this. So in each graph, the x-axis is a gradient of size class going from seedlings. Oh, I was trying to get the arrow again. I'm having trouble with this arrow. There we go. So here's the size class gradient. And then over here is percent survival with 100 here and 0 here. And first of all, we'll see that there's a difference between the sand and the moraine. In the control, there was 100% almost always survival, pre and post treatment. But on the moraine, there was a decrease, and this occurred across the cut and burn treatments as well at the seedling size class. And such a decrease didn't occur on the sand. And so we think that this is another indication of the impact of that heavy rainfall in that spring, causing mortality of seedlings on the moraine where the water tended to pool, whereas on the sand the water would just drain off. We see also that these graphs show in the moraine a tendency of increasing survival with increasing size class. And we see some of that also here on the sand, but the cut treatment has is not consistent with that. So that's an interaction. And then we see that the cut and burned treatment combined had a greater impact on survival in both cases compared to the other treatments. So it appears that our treatments were having a greater impact on individual stem survival on the sand. Okay. This is the numbers of resprouts per meter squared in the same size classes that we had in the previous slide. There's the size class seedlings to greater than 15 millimeters. And here, this is density per meter squared. So here's 10 and 0 and minus 2. And we see the controls in both cases in resprouts and in root sucker plots had no change in stem density, but that there was an increasing number of stems with increasing diameter. So the bigger plants are producing more resprouts and more root suckers. And then in addition, we see here that on the burn treatment produced more root suckers for some reason. This is a graph of the maximum temperature achieved based on thermocouples and change in total stem density in our meter, this average of our 4 meter squared subplots. And we see that there is a linear relationship. These two on the upper right are at the Marquette Trail sand site, which is on top of a sand dune. That's the one that's really infested that I showed a picture of. And this one, these always had higher temperatures compared to all the other fires. So there's the greater the temperature, the greater the damage to the individuals, then the more sprouting they must be having. This is change in cover from pre and post. So this is a reduction in cover. A negative change is a reduction in cover. And we see there was the greater reduction in cover in the spring fires compared to the fall fires. Not quite sure why that is, whether it has to do with duration from the treatment to when we sampled, so that the spring samples, the treatments were about 4 months before we measured, whereas in the fall, our post-treatment was about 9 months later. So not quite sure about that. But there was a significant treatment effect, and it was dominated by the ancillary treatments. That is the July cut, which occurred 2 weeks before we sampled, and then the fall herbicide. So it's no surprise that these two treatments would cause the greatest reduction in cover of bittersweet. But also the burn treatment had a significantly greater reduction in cover compared to the control. Not sure why the cut and burn didn't have a similar or a stronger effect, but it didn't. Now we're going to look at change in total density. And here on the x-axis we have our treatments again, with the control in the middle. And we had positive changes except for a slight negative change in the control. These are essentially zero, no change, the ancillary and the control. But we see a significant increase in density of stems per meter squared. So there's approximately 12 stems per meter squared in the cut and burn treatment compared to, and the 10 in the burn treatment, significantly different from the control and the ancillary. And the cut treatment was intermediate. If we express these data as relative to the pre-values, we get an idea of how much the density of stems increased. And we see that there was a significantly greater increase, more than 100%, in the burn and the cut and burn treatments combined compared to the control and the ancillary treatment. And again, the cut treatment was intermediate. So it looks like fire is having a greater impact on resprouting than, that's interesting. There's a graph there, but you can't see it. Seedlings were also significant between treatment and soil and season. And I'll just say that there were a few sites that in the cut and burn treatment must have had a lot of seeds because they had a high flush of seedlings, whereas in most treatments there were basically there was no effect on seedling establishment. Looking at the smallest size class, again, this is the less than 2.5 millimeter treatment class. We again have our treatments, and we have, this is changes in density per meter squared, and we see a significant increase in the burn and the cut and burn. So burning, whether they've been cut or not, is increasing the number of stems in this size class. And this makes sense because this is the smallest size class, and so when a stem is killed, anything that resprouts is going to start out in the smallest size class. But if we look at the size class on the right, the percentage increase in this size class, it was over 400 in our two burn treatments, 400. So that's almost 4 times as many stems increase compared to the controls and the ancillary treatment and the cut treatment. So we're really knocking them back into smaller size classes by burning. So what did we do in terms of, what did we see in terms of total nonstructural carbohydrates? Well, we see the typical seasonal progression where you have peaks in the dormant season, And then you have a depression in May, early growing season. This depression occurs when the plants are starting to regrow, and they're depleting their reserves for that initial growth. And then once they have enough leaf biomass, they start pumping carbohydrates back down to the roots. And you see that here, and you see that here. So none of our dormant season treatments, whether cut or burn or whatever, had any effect, or even in the controls, had no effect on total nonstructural carbohydrates. It was only the summer cut. And it reduced the carbohydrate by 50% compared to the other treatments in July. So this is an indication of a potential strategy for weakening the bittersweet plants, and I'll talk about that later. In addition, that previous graph was combined starches and sugars, but the effect that we see here is due to starch differences. With sugars, the only significant effect we found with sugars was that in the second year after herbiciding, the plants that were herbicided had lower sugar concentrations in the following growing season. So that's an interesting effect. So that says that the herbicide is really doing something. So let's take a look at some examples. The 2009, this is the same plot, 4 years. In 2009, we took the pictures late, so you can see that lime green color of bittersweet. And you can see that there's just bittersweet and bittersweet and bittersweet all 4 years. Here's another site where here's the pre-year, and let's see, and you can see there's some bittersweet growing up here. And then in the second year after the treatment, in 2010, wow, these really got funny. You can see that there's not as much bittersweet climbing up, but then the second year after the treatment, you can see the rapid regrowth of these sprouts into the subcanopy. And this is typical of a fire effect that we see with bittersweet. And then the second year after treatment, we see continued presence of bittersweet climbing into the canopy. And oh yeah, so there you can see the stems growing up, and there as well. And then this is a fall cut and burn, and here's the plot, and then here's again another pre-treatment photo where the arrow is, and then this is post-treatment and post-treatment, and you can just see the vast proliferation of bittersweet at this site that was already quite highly infested. And then this last one is a herbicide one. Yes?
No. Yeah. I just wanted to, this question is related to the photographs. Ken Gravy asked if the uncut vines were wild grape.
Yes, I think so. Like in this picture here. What happened to my arrow? They may not, they don't look cut, do they? They might be bittersweet that we cut, and they still look like they're there because they're hanging. So, yeah. Okay, let's see. So herbicide, here's a herbicide. Thank you for that. I'd been looking for messages and none had appeared so far. So here we have a plot that was herbicided in between 2010 and 2011. And let's see if I can get my arrow back. Where's my arrow? There it is. Okay, so this is a pre-treatment photo. And then you can see there wasn't much cover in this plot to begin with, but there's virtually no cover. And these were foliar sprayed plots in this case. So this is to show you what fire is doing to bittersweet. So the stems here that have pink tape on them, pink paint, these three, were top killed by the fire. And then that, we tagged them before the fire. And then these are all the root suckers associated with that after the fire. So you can see the prolific regrowth. In addition, you can see the orange roots that go along the ground, and you can see the root hairs that are white or gray. So this plant is quite versatile to being damaged. Okay. So here's another plant. This stem was top killed. It resprouted here, and then there's some root suckers sprouts here, but it looks like possibly this has achieved apical dominance, and these aren't growing as well. And then we had tried to do a study where on the sand dunes you can dig up bittersweet plants quite easily. We identified individual plants that we thought were just single-stemmed plants and tagged them, and then they were burned, and we came back to dig them up, and not a single one of them was an individual. They were actually clones. And this was the most impressive one, and we stopped after 4 meters of digging, or more than that actually, and it must have gone on for tens of meters. This shows you physically how this thing can spread widely. So survival increased with greater stem diameter for the burn cut and cut burn treatments. Combined cutting and burning has a greater impact on stem mortality than each alone. And when top killed, bittersweet stems can root sucker, sometimes in greater numbers than resprouts on surviving stems, not always, but sometimes. And dormant season fire has no effect on TNC, but cutting in July and subsequent regrowth reduces TNC by an additional 50% from May. And let me emphasize again, we cut these in July, and then 2 weeks later we harvested the roots. So it didn't take long for that depletion to occur. At the population level, burning reduced cover of bittersweet more than in the control treatment. And July cutting and herbicide reduced cover of bittersweet more than the control treatment as well. Burning with or without cutting increased total stem density by a factor of 2 or more compared to the control plots in the spring. And burning increased the density of stems that were less than 2.5 millimeters by a factor of 4 or more. So that's pretty daunting. And resprouting and root suckering did increase with greater stem diameter, and resprouting and root suckering increased with greater fire temperature as a result of greater stem mortality, leading to a greater numerical response. And cutting produced fewer resprouts compared to the burn and cut and burn in the less than 2.5 millimeter size class. So the level of resprouting after burn will depend on both on the interaction between the fire intensity and the local size distribution of stems. So if you have older plants, you might get more response than if you have smaller stems, smaller plants. And local soil and nutrient and moisture conditions will play an important role, and I'm just referring to the results I haven't finished in regards to the relationships between these changes that we saw in our treatments and the environmental changes that occurred in our plots. So, this is the reality if you keep burning Oriental bittersweet. Okay, Stacey.
Thanks, Noel.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about fire effects on bittersweet at the landscape scale. So the last kind of thing we wanted to look at was at the larger scale of Indiana dunes. Are there patterns that we see with bittersweet on the landscape there related to fire? So basically we wanted to look at where Oriental bittersweet was located at Indiana dunes in relation to fire frequency and time since last burn. So we had GIS layers back, I think, 32 years approximately.
Yeah.
And we used that to examine if there were any patterns on the landscape. So we also looked at other extrinsic factors that we could determine through GIS, such as distance to roads and railroads, and to see if those things had an influence too, because we know that invasive species oftentimes are related to rights of way and things like that. And then we also explored if categorical environmental variables were related to Oriental bittersweet distribution. So as I talk about the protocol briefly, we also took environmental information at these bittersweet plots, and we wanted to see if those had were able to better explain where Oriental bittersweet was located on the landscape. So our methods were as follows. We sampled 368 plots across fire habitats and fire frequency. So we produced these plots in a random manner using GIS. However, we stratified them to make sure that they were kind of evenly distributed across different fire frequencies as well as geographically distributed throughout Indiana. So we didn't want a bunch of plots all in one place, basically. And this is images of me and my field assistant, Katie. We were going out, basically here's with our GPS unit with those random points to go find them out on the landscape. So here's an image of Indiana dunes again, and this shows the 168 plots that we had. And they're all throughout. There's Lake Michigan up here, and then some of the outlying whole over here. And then this is a fire frequency map. The redder that the colors are, more frequently these areas have burned at Indiana dunes. Kind of zoom in on one of the areas. This area over here. Okay. So then we sampled environmental factors. So when we got to our random point using the GPS unit, we did a kind of a full survey. We had a little data dictionary entry system on the GPS, and so that way we could do kind of a rapid assessment of the location. So we determined the habitat type, the soil moisture, the canopy cover of those plots using categorical variables. And then we sampled the presence, so if the bittersweet was there or not. That's kind of the simple response. The abundance of bittersweet, so that's basically using a categorical scale. Did we have one plant? Did we have more than 1,000 plants? That type of thing. The distribution of Oriental bittersweet within the plot sets, the spatial distribution, so were there single plants? Were they in clumps? Was it dense infestation throughout? And then finally, the approximate cover of Oriental bittersweet, again in categorical variables. So was it 1% of the plot? Was it 6 to 25% of the plot? Was it 100% of the plot? So we did it in that way. And so here are the very preliminary results that we've gotten so far. So Oriental bittersweet was located throughout Indiana dunes. That wasn't really surprising. One thing that was a little bit disturbing was that the abundance of it, in terms of the number of plots that it was located in, was an order of magnitude higher than a survey that Noel had conducted 10 years prior, where he had found Oriental bittersweet in 2.4% of the plots he had surveyed, and we found it in 27% now of the plots that we surveyed. So that's pretty big explosion of bittersweet there. And using stepwise, or not stepwise, but using AIC step regressions, we found that the presence, so the simple presence or absence of bittersweet, was negative influenced by canopy cover. So it likes a little bit more open habitats. Fire frequency, so that was interesting. And then also negatively influenced by distance to roads and railroads. I was a little surprised by that. However, it can, as we've seen throughout this talk, infiltrate forests and things like that. So it might not be as influenced by roads as we might think, as some other invasives are. And then abundance, remember abundance was basically how many plants we would see within a plot approximately. So the abundance, so this is only in plots that had bittersweet, not including the ones that had none, was greater in plots that had low to moderate burn frequency, so kind of that intermediate disturbance. So those plots that didn't burn a lot, like all the time, but kind of this intermediate disturbance, abundance was much greater. And it was marginally lower in plots, again, with this greater canopy cover. So forested plots, even though they can have bittersweet, they might not be as abundant. And we're planning to follow this up with a lot more analyses and hoping to form some sort of perhaps predictive map that we can sort of plug in environmental and fire variables and perhaps get back kind of a risk map of Oriental bittersweet at Indiana dunes that might be able to be applied elsewhere.
So I'm going to use this.
Oh, I see that there. Yeah.
Oh.
So Stacey, I just wanted to, Ken had a quick question. Can you go back and analyze the distribution in relation to the power line right-of-ways? Is that one of your plans?
I don't know, Noel. Do we have a map of that? Do we get one?
You mean of power lines? Yeah, we probably could. Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, that would be interesting. Okay, so I'm going to go on here. I created this life cycle diagram to sort of try and summarize the life cycle of life history of Oriental bittersweet, and we can start with flowering and fruiting adults. So each of these, come on, trying to grab that arrow again. I don't know. I have troubles with this arrow thing. Well, anyways, the outer ring. Here we go. Now where is it? The outer ring represent different stages. So we got flowering adults on the right, and then it goes down to seeds and seedlings, and then sapling and understory and trailing plants, and then overstory climbers, and back to fruiting of adults. Any of these square that have a circular bar that returns to itself represents yearly transitions. Seeds don't have that because the seeds don't live for more than a year. And then seedlings don't have such an arrow because they either die or they turn into saplings. And then in the middle we have what we could call the resprouting vortex if we wanted to, where a damage like fire. So all the arrows that lead in here, fire is going to send some portion of the plants into sprouting and root suckering mode. And so this is a problem both in terms of if you're trying to control it because it's becoming more numerically abundant and so forth. So the yellow bars at the top and the blue bar represents cut and in the spring or summer to prevent plants from fruiting and flowering. We might do that with plants that are starting to get up into the overstory. And then we might cut the yellow bar. There we go. This yellow bar would be cutting adults so that they don't produce seeds. So it's just sort of general conceptual diagram. And now I'd like to go on from here to talk about our main question. So to burn or not to burn Oriental bittersweet? Well, the answer is no, it's not a good idea because it induces that resprouting cycle. But burning could be used to kill seeds and seedlings. So it's a conundrum in a way. It is a conundrum. Burning does not make the landscape more susceptible to invasion, so that's good for management. But so what are some strategies for controlling Oriental bittersweet? If it's flowering or fruiting, you would want to cut an herbicide to eliminate the seed source. If cutting, it would be best to do it in late June or early July, and then you herbicide the stumps because then that would, when it's trying to resprout, even though it's herbicided, that's going to reduce the reserves as well. You could delay and try and do some treatment later, perhaps a foliar spray, but that has some problems as well. If burning, it's best to cut and herbicide prior to burning. You really don't want to get one of these massive clones that we see in the landscape. And late winter burns would be best to kill seeds, and it seems that fall burns would be best to kill seedlings. So I haven't really talked about herbicide. We did do that, the foliar herbicide treatment, and unfortunately that had impacts on native species that were under the bittersweet by getting sprayed as well. But there would be situations where you might not have any other choice, such as that area that I've shown the picture of. This is a stem that's been herbicided, and you can see the thin bark, and you can see the large cells. So in the end, fire is a two-edged sword. It can be helpful in eliminating the younger stages of bittersweet, but in established populations, it's just going to make it worse without some other control method. What we don't know is when do these plants, at what age do these plants go from single stems to sending roots out along the soil surface and infiltrating adjacent habitats. That's a large unanswered question. So with that, I guess I'd like to thank you, for letting us share our research findings. Yeah.
Actually, Noel and Stacey, I think it's our group of participants that thank you.
Okay.
We do have a couple of questions and comments. A follow-up to Ken's question about the power line rights of ways, I think brings up a good point, is understanding those vectors, on the landscape are really important. When Stacey mentioned that it seemed to be not associated with those transportation corridors, I was assuming that perhaps because birds seem to be a vector that they don't need that kind of corridor, but obviously there's many questions to be asked.
It might also have to do with
in
the duration of the infestation in the landscape, because if you drive around the east unit of Indiana Dunes, you think most of the bittersweet is around the edges of the roads, but the long and that may be a primary. Well, actually, home sites are also another. And in our context, it's actually home sites might be the more important source. From people throwing out their fall bouquets. And but I think the longer it's in the landscape, the further in it can infiltrate. And both the work we did here and some other work has demonstrated that Oriental bittersweet basically will invade anywhere pretty much along the successional gradient. But its dominance is sort of in early to mid successional habitats. Do you have anything to add, Stacey?
No, it's a really good point that kind of that initial vector, or not vector, but area of infiltration is on the edges, but then from there it can kind of make its way in. And probably after a certain amount of time, it's not going to be showing as much of a difference between roadsides versus interiors. But we were saying about the home sites, Noel, it might be a neat idea to try to make buffers around them if we know where they are, and then use that also as a factor in our model.
Yes.
Very good. Well, this may be more of a comment than a question from Glenn Pollock. He said that on a prairie restoration project on the Los Hills of Iowa, after removing brush, there was an explosion of bittersweet. He says they applied an application of remedy, trichopor. The next spring, the effect of the herbicide was minimal. In that year, they waited until August. They mowed the bittersweet. They applied remedy after the resprout in late September. And this year being an unusual year with little rain, they saw little regrowth. The plants may be hidden among the growth of weedy plants. They do plan to burn in the spring of the treated areas to remove the invasive plant biomass. The location is at Vincent Bluffs Preserve in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Perhaps Glenn would be someone to make contact with just to see what they're doing and see if there's some insights, on a more individual level. There's quite a bit of comment there.
To us, I think that moisture availability makes a difference, and bittersweet doesn't, do well in habitats that tend towards the wet end of the gradient, and you don't find it in wetlands, of course. So it could be that that's another factor in this that complicates it all, and that the annual variation in rainfall can wreak havoc with what your treatments are doing with the bittersweet.
Okay. I have a couple of questions here, but I will answer Tom Vorik's question. Yes, the slides will be available. Actually, the recorded presentation will be available to view probably at the same web address that you came to join the webinar, but you'll be able to find that by going back to our website and navigating to the Learning Opportunities page, and you'll find information about each of our webinar recordings there. Noel and Stacey, as I watched this and listened to this, I couldn't help but think of the role of the fire manager, the resource manager in a project like this. That certainly, it probably was a significant challenge for them, but also perhaps be interesting to hear your insights on finding partners and what it is that you really need from them and what it is that they should expect if they join with you in a project such as this.
I would say that we could not have done this project without the help of the fire crew at Indiana Dunes. They were invaluable because we did the work on their property. And so, there was a lot of coordination that went on. There were some difficulties that we had, and that had to do with restrictions on burning because of endangered species. It wasn't a Park Service problem, but, I mean, it was an issue. Let's see, what else to say in response to your question. We would just been quite grateful for the help that the Park Service fire crew did. The guys, weren't so thrilled about burning little areas, but that was wonderful. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it is something that I think is our folks need to be aware of. The role that they have, the time it probably takes, and the change in the way they normally do business, as you mentioned. But research such as this are the kinds of projects that are lacking here in the Midwest. The knowledge that you've put out here about Oriole bittersweet is something that's lacking for a number of different communities or species, and I'd look forward to seeing more work like this done here in this part of the country. I have one more question, and then I will see if there's any last comments. Obviously, there's a lot of findings here. Folks have been exposed to this, but I'm sure that we haven't internalized all your findings. Is there a publication or a guide that goes along with the webinar that we can make sure folks have access to?
A paper for publication on the susceptibility study that Stacey talked about, and I'm still working on the bigger paper on the establishment study. We will have a summary fact sheet that we will hopefully get out before the end of the year if we're lucky. So that would be a general source. I also forgot to, and maybe most people know about our identification fact sheet. I forgot to bring that in and post it on the website. Because we have that. If you just Google USGS and bittersweet identification, you'll find it. So we have other publications. Our report to the Joint Fire Science Program, I think, is on the internet, but it's very general. So, and actually, we're working on a short, maybe 20-minute video. We have that about half done. So.
Well, very good. I certainly will be interested in the fact sheet, and we'll make an effort to share that. And I'm sure that it'll be of interest to folks. So with that, I don't know, do either of you have a closing comment
well, I think our most
about
significant
the subject today
contribution,
before Nate and I close this out?
besides us, looking at what fire does to bittersweet, was the fact that we actually found sort of that if we cut in the growing season, we can knock back the reserves. That's provides an opportunity for perhaps some better control strategies. We did have a separate experiment that I didn't talk about, and I'm working on that data, where we tried to do a little more some more management type activities, but I'm having some problems with the data, so I haven't finished analyzing that. So anything you want to say, Stacey?
No, I mean, it's just that's a good thing to kind of be proactive on. I was going to say, like, one thing that the fire people really helped us out with was they kind of saw the same sorts of problems that we were seeing as far as after prescribed burns, that we were seeing bittersweet kind of going gangbusters, and they were willing to try to work along with the ecologists together so that we could come up with a plan or a strategy to kind of combat this plant, because obviously fire management, it needs to be done in these places because there's other issues about. But if we can come up with ways to kind of work with ecologists, fire managers together to kind of mediate the effects of bittersweet on these places that they have to burn, I think that was kind of like a good thing that came out of this type of study.
Well, thank you both. This has been very enlightening. Certainly it raises the specter of the issues that we may not even be aware of when we plan and conduct prescribed burns. It's certainly important for us to know what it is that's out there in our burn units and around our burn units, and to be as aware of what we might be doing if we're burning in those sites. So with that, Nate, do you have any closing comments that you'd like
not really,
to make?
Zeke, but I'll just second your comment that if they get a fact sheet put together,
webinar
we'd
today?
be pretty interested in promoting that as well.
Okay. Great.
Great.
Well, very good. I would like to thank the folks that joined us. I think we had a pretty good group. At one point, we were at 40 participants. So I think it was a very meaningful subject, and I appreciate you asking us to sponsor it, Noel, and we look forward to working with you again in the future. I will say that our next webinar, it's called Climate Change and Forest Ecosystem Vulnerability in the Lake States, How to Account for Wildfire, is scheduled for November 20th. It'll be in the morning that time, 10:30 Eastern, 9:30 Central. Certainly, we thank you for participating today. We ask you to visit our website, sign up for our newsletters and future mailings. You can see our website right at the bottom there, lakestatesfiresci.net. Certainly, Nate has a similar one for tpostfirescience.org. And I think it's worthwhile to go and sign up for those notices. And again, feel free to contact either of us. Nate and I both look forward to receiving questions, comments, and ideas as we work on fire science implementation across the Midwest. With that, thank you all, and we'll see you next month.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, well,
Yeah,
I appreciate that, Noel.
Okay,
and,
thank you.
Stacey,
It was fun.
certainly we'll be in
Appreciate it.
contact.
Okay. Bye.
Mm-hmm.